Hi y'all, it's Cathy. I'm out here in my shed in the dark to tell y'all a scary ghost story. Anyway, I decided to go ahead and pre-record a couple of them so that I could just get them. They're short little stories and I'm gonna get them out of the way. I may tell two on here. The fan's blowing on me because I'm out in the cottage in the hot, and it's hotter in here tonight than it was this morning. Anyway, where was I going to start? Okay, I have a couple of little short ghost stories that I'm going to tell you. Spirit stories. Anyway, one time I had this little old mobile home. I had bought it because I went through divorce and I wound up buying this little mobile home for my kids and I to live in, and I was really poor. And I bought some window air conditioning units, which I need in this building and I'm fixing to get. We just got the sheetrock all in and I just got it painted and everything, so I'm fixing to get the air conditioning and the heater and all that stuff. Anyway, at that time, which this was, 40 years ago, not 40, maybe 30 something. I'm 64 now, and I was probably 34, 35 years old then. Anyway, 30 something years ago. Anyway, I had bought this older mobile home and I had put floors in and painted and did all the things to get it fixed up for my kids and I. And I had remarried for a short time to a friend who had worked with my horses. And anyway, he was a little bit younger than me, and I was a braver person than he was spiritually. So one night we'd gone to bed and I had just bought this little window air conditioning unit for the bedroom and a big one for the living room and the rest of the house. And I was laying there in bed and I heard something bang on the side of the trailer. It was an old metal trailer, and it just sounded like somebody had a baseball bat and they were down at the corner of the room and they just swung it and hit the trailer so hard that it shook and rattled and made all kind of noise because it was a metal trailer. And then it was as if they took 2 or 3 steps on, coming towards us, and they hit the side of the trailer again. And I sat up and I said, "What the heck?" And he was scared, and I got up and I went down the hallway. And as I was going down the hallway, every 2 or 3 steps that I took, it seemed like they took the same 2 or 3 steps and they would just whack the side of the trailer as if they had a baseball bat whacking the side of my trailer. And it made me mad. And at that time I didn't have a gun or anything else. And anyway, but I had my redneck girl stuff. So anyway, I went all the way through the house and got to the front door, and it sounded like, and they banged it again just before I opened the door. And I thought that when I opened the door I was going to be facing somebody. But I opened the door and he was telling me, "Don't open the door." And I know all these spirit people say, "Don't ever open the door." But I was going to confront it. So anyway, I opened the door and there was nobody there. So I went outside. I looked all under the trailer. I looked up on top, but I couldn't see very well. But you could hear something, like if a little squirrel animal got on the trailer, you could have heard it. So I didn't hear anybody get up on the trailer. And I lived on a 3rd acre, and it was cleared acre. If they would have ran, I would have heard them, I would have saw them, something. And I didn't see or hear anybody. So I went back in the house, locked the door, went back to bed. And then it happened again. About 2 or 3 hours later, the same thing. I hear the whack on the side of the house, and I started to get up, but then I heard it sounded like somebody got a hold of my little air conditioner and they were shaking it, trying to pull it out of the window, and the back door was right beside where the air conditioning was installed. And so I jumped up, and by this time he is yelling at me, "Don't open the door." He was so afraid. And if I opened the door, I would be right next to whoever was trying to pull my air conditioner. They weren't getting in. I worked hard for that stuff. So I opened the back door and there was nobody there. I got out. I went under the trailer. I looked all under the trailer. I got a ladder, looked up on top of the trailer. There was nobody anywhere. So I knew this was spiritual, and went to bed, and he said that where he was from, or in his religion, that they believed that when one of your friends died, that they would come back to see you, and that he had recently had a friend die, and that person wasn't such a nice person, and he was worried that it was that person. And I said, well then, we just need to pray against this. So I just prayed against it, and it went away. It never happened again. So that's my one story. I call that Bumps in the Night. I wrote that in one of my books, I think, or on the website that I write on. Then there was, let's see what other stories I can tell you that are short. Dang it, I knew a minute ago and now I've forgotten. Let me think. Anyway, if y'all have any comments, you can leave them. And remember, we never say anything rude except when pigs fly, if we don't believe any of the stories. I think I'll cut this tape and then I'll come back when I think of the next story that I'm going to tell you, because I have a few little short ones that I could tell. Well, you know, I'm thinking of another one where I was at the beauty salon, and this young lady came by. This might be a long story. Anyway, she came by and she asked me if she could hang a flyer in my window to my beauty shop. And I said, sure, what's it about? And she said, well, my brother's missing. And I said, oh no, you know. And she said, yeah. She said, he's been gone for several days, and he took my mom's car, and he was supposed to pick up my niece and nephew from school. He never showed up, and he wouldn't have been someone to do something like that. And I said, well, what's his name? And she told me, and I said, I'm only asking because sometimes I'm able to help people with things like this, and it just depends. So, you know, just tell me what his name is. And she told me what his name was. And when she told me, I started seeing this street, and it was like I could see all the way down the street. And I said, does he live in a house that has a lot of pine trees and shrubbery and stuff around it on the right hand side, the third house from the end? And I said, and there's green trim around the windows. And she said, that's my house. I said, oh. And she said, well, but he's over there a lot. I said, okay. I said, does he live? I mean, the other house was on the end of the street. I said, does he live in the third house on the left, right when you turn on the street? Does he live on the third house from the left? And there's a lot of palm trees and greenery in the front yard. And she said, that's his boss's house. And she said, but he didn't live there. He lived behind there, down a dirt road that goes past that house. Right, you pull into their driveway and you go back. It's like a shared lot, and he lived behind his boss's house in a house with his mother. And I said, okay, well, I said, that's all I'm getting right now. She said, you know, he spent a lot of time at my house down the street. And I said, okay. I said, that's all I'm getting right now, but if I get anything else, you know, I'll let you know. So she left, and, you know, I started talking to my friends about the story of him missing and how he was supposed to pick up the kids from school and he never made it, and where he lived and all of that, but we really didn't know anything else. Well, one of my customers said, well, I wonder if it has anything to do with that body they found up off of the freeway. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, up in Conroe, they found a body off the side of the freeway, and I remember when I was telling her about the greenery, I said, I just keep seeing tall grass, you know, greenery all around me. And she said, oh, okay, well, maybe that's my house because I have a lot of plants and all this. Well, anyway, when this lady was telling me this body was found up off of the freeway, she said, yeah, the mowers who were mowing the grass found this body. And I said, oh my gosh, I wonder if it's him, you know, because that wasn't that far from where we live. And so she said, what are you going to do? And she said, well, call my husband. He still has the paper, I think. And it was really odd that somebody came into my shop, which was in another town, a rural town, that took the newspaper from a town that they didn't even live in and told me about this body. But anyway, I said, okay. So I called her husband, and he read the article to me, and I thanked him for that. And she said, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I guess I'll call her and tell her about the body being found and ask her if her brother has any identifying marks or anything. So I did. I called her and I said, we just heard that there was a body found up off of the freeway, and the mowers who mow the grass found him. I said, I think that's why I kept getting the greenery, all the greenery around me. I kept seeing greenery. She said, oh no, I said, does your brother have any identifying marks? And she said, yes. And I said, well, she said, what am I supposed to do? I said, well, probably call the coroner's office and tell them that your brother's missing and give them his identifying marks and see if they might be able to. I said, you may have to go down there and try to identify him. I just don't know. So she did that, and it was not her brother. And I kept thinking, yes, it is. Something's wrong here. And I didn't say that to her, but I was like, yes, it is. I keep seeing this. But anyway, she said, I said, did you call and report him as a missing person? And she said, yes, we tried to, but they said that he was an adult and that he could go anywhere he wanted to, anytime he wanted to, and he didn't have to tell anyone where he was going. And I said, what? She said, yeah, but he's got mother's car. And I said, well, you call them and tell them that he was given permission to use that car for that day, but it's been 3 days and he no longer has permission, and your mother's responsible for that car and she wants her car back. So she, let me say that many of my family members are in law enforcement, and most of the time I am totally on the side of law enforcement. But sometimes, something slips through the cracks, or somebody has a bad attitude, or something happens. So, this is just human nature. I don't know what the problem was. But anyway, she said, they won't help us. They told us they wouldn't help us. And I said, well, you call them back and tell them that your mother is financially responsible for that car, and she wants to know where her car is, and so that car needs to be looked for because it's been stolen. So she did that, and so she did that, and then she said okay, she hung up, and then she called me back about 2 days later and said, hey, they have my mom's car. They brought it back to us, and there's a lot of stuff in it that doesn't belong to her, and we wondered if you would come out and look at it. And I said, oh my gosh, why do you have it? Why don't the police have it? Where's your brother? She said he wasn't with the car when they found the car. And I said, oh my gosh. And so I said, did they list him as a missing person now? She said, no, they didn't. I said, why not? She said, they just told us they couldn't help us, that it must have been some kind of a drug deal or something. She said, will you come over to our house and look at the car? And I said, yeah, but I've never really done anything like that. Y'all, I did a whole lot of firsts at that time because I'd never done any of this. But when people heard about my abilities, they started asking me to do these kinds of things. So anyway, and I just sort of prayed about it each time and decided what to do or not do. But anyway, I went over there a little later that day, and when I got there, I drove right up to the house because I had seen it in my vision, and then I drove back down that driveway to the other house, and there was a lot of people there, and I felt like there was somebody there that was not so nice, but that was watching me. And I was a little nervous about going because it was all them and me, but I went back there, and there was probably 5 or 6 adults there. And the young lady asked me if I would. We sat and talked in the kitchen, and I said, this might not turn out good, and are you prepared to, handle it if it doesn't turn out good? They said, we'd rather know than not know. So if you get anything at all, just tell us. I said, okay. I said, I've really never done this. I don't know what I'm going to get or not get. I'm just praying about it and waiting for the Lord to show me. So I sat there with them, and we actually did have a prayer together. And then she said, well, do you want to go to my brother's room and see his room? I said, sure. So I went in there and I said, can you leave me in here by myself for a few minutes? And so they did. They left, and I was sitting there, and I was just, absorbing whatever information might come to me. And I had my eyes closed, and I felt something press up against my knee. And I opened my eyes, and there was this huge pit bull. I was scared to death of pit bulls. I was. Now I have one. That was my son's, and now I have her. But anyway, I was terrified of pit bulls. I still am, depending on the pit bull. Anyway, she had her nose pressed against my knee, smelling at me so hard. And I said, can somebody come get this dog? So they came in, and she would not leave. She would not leave me. She kept looking over behind us in the corner of the room. And I said, she's seeing something over there. I don't know what, or telling me something. I said, but you got to take her out of here. I'm in a certain zone, and I don't want her getting scared of me, or, you know, feeling something weird and biting me. So they tried to take her out, and she would not go out. They put a leash on her, tried to drag her out. She would not budge. She was not going to leave me. It's like she connected to me, and she wasn't going to leave me. And so I finally just stood up and walked outside as she followed me. And then we closed the door, and I said, I'll come right back and get you, you know. And I left her outside. And I came back in there, and I walked over to where she had been looking. And I looked around, and I looked, I did feel something there too, but I couldn't see anything. And I kept looking, and finally I got down and looked under the bed, and I saw a cell phone. So his cell phone was there, and I picked it up, and I gave it to the sister, and I said, is this his cell phone? And she said, yes, it is. I said, well, maybe the police would want this, because why would he leave without his cell phone? And maybe it'll show who he spoke to last, or something that would give them details that they could investigate. So she took the cell phone, and I decided that I was frustrated with the help that they were not getting. They asked me to go sit in the car. I said, well, okay, but I had wanted to, you know, sit in his room first, so I did that. And then they said, are you ready to go to the car? I said, I guess so. So we went out there, and I got in the car, and oh my gosh, there was cigarette butts all over the place. I looked up, and there was a tow tag, you know, that you hang on your mirror to go through tolls. There was one of those up there, and it had a bloody thumbprint on it. I looked up on the ceiling, and there was blood spattered all over the top of the car, in the ceiling, and in the back there was all kinds of things that would belong to a woman, not a man. And I said, oh my gosh, did they come out here? Did they process this car? She goes, no, they won't come. They told us that it was just part of a drug deal, and they weren't going to get involved in it. And I said, well, you know what? If it was part of a drug deal, then they need to tell you what happened and where your brother is. I said, let me call them. So I went in the house, and I called, and I talked to the one detective that they had been talking to, or the policeman, whatever he was. And he said the same kinds of things. No, it wasn't listed as missing, and didn't this have something to do with drug deal? I said, I don't know, but her family needs to know. I mean, his family needs to know. And I said, and he said, he wasn't going to help. And I said, hey, you know what? Did I get the wrong phone number? And he said, well, I don't know. Where's your house located, or whatever? And I told him, he goes, yeah, you have the wrong phone number. And he was real smart aleck with me. And he said, you need to call this other phone county, or whatever. So I did, and I was upset by then, and I called the other county, and I started telling them everything that had happened, and how we had tried to report him as a missing person, and he had been missing now for like 3 days or so, maybe 4 days. And they could not believe it. They couldn't believe that they had not reported him as a missing person, and the car stolen, and all the things. So they got on it, and within a minute or two, that other guy was calling back going, oh, we're so sorry. It was a computer error. The wrong information was written down on there, and all this. So it started all heading in the right direction. The police got involved. I really still don't know what the hang up was about that. But anyway, they said I said, where did they find the car? And they said that they found it, you know, parked in front of somebody's house on some street. And they said, they found the brother, and he had admitted himself into a hospital, and apparently he had done some kind of drug deal at a hotel. I forgot to tell you that when I had left the house, I had driven out. Before I heard the information about what had happened, I had driven out of the house. One of my friends was with me. I forgot, she did go with me because I was afraid to go by myself. And I just wasn't remembering her because she really didn't do anything except accompany me, and I wasn't remembering that she was there until I started leaving, and then I remember, oh yeah, she was with me, and we're pulling out, and she said, I said, I think he went to the right when he left here, and as we got down to the end of the street, I was like, he met somebody, and she goes, well, do you think he had picked up his check, and but he had not gone to the bank and cashed it. And she said, well, you know, there's a little store right down the road. Maybe he went in there and cashed his check because some of the grocery stores around here cash paychecks. I said, really? So we went down and drove into the parking lot, and I was like, yes, he came in here. I said, but he was meeting somebody over there at that taco stand. There was a taco stand in the parking lot. I said, he met somebody over at that taco stand, and he knew him from work. And it turns out that he had, now that I know the full story, I'll tell you what happened. Just a minute though, let me back up. She called me back and told me that they had found her brother. He was in the hospital. He had checked himself in, and that he and two of the guys he worked with had taken the car and driven out of state and come back, and there was some kind of drugs involved, and that one of the other ones was in jail. And I said, let's see, I don't know, but anyway, I said, you know what, you need to check that body up on the road, that it might be the other worker, because it feels to me like that body is involved in this situation. And she said, well, they mentioned that when they found my mother's car, it was parked 2 streets from where the guy that was found on the freeway lived. So that was the last I heard of the story. So that's that story. Anyway, that's more of a spirit story, not really a ghost story. I didn't have any poltergeist activity or anything like that. I just kept getting, visions and information about what had happened during the time and what we needed to do next. So there was a lot of blood in that car, and it belonged to somebody, and I'm pretty sure they were supposed to be investigating it, that it belonged to the man that was found on the freeway. Anyway, that's the end of that story, and I have several other short ones that I may come back on here after I look them up and try to, refresh my memory as to what they are. So I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks. Good night.